Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Over many years, the leadership of the Canadian nonprofit sector has been criticized for its lack of diversity. As recently as 2019, the Senate of Canada published Catalyst for Change, a roadmap to a stronger charitable sector. Among its recommendations was a proposed change to amend the Income Tax Act to require charities to report on board diversity when they file their annual T3010s. Senator Ratna Omadvar has since proposed Bill S-279 to do just that. And recently, the Diversity Institute, in partnership with Civic Action, has released a report entitled Diversity and Inclusion in Nonprofit Leadership in Ontario. Are we there yet? Joining us today to discuss the findings of the report, the proposed bill, and the current state of equity and diversity in Canada's nonprofit leadership is Anne-Marie Pham, the CEO of Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, or CCDI. Anne-Marie Pham has worked with diverse communities and workplaces for over 25 years. She has a deep understanding of issues and opportunities related to diversity and inclusion and specializes in mobilizing, educating, and sharing the latest research and promising practices on equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. Anne-Marie brings a unique set of skills to her work at CCDI, having worked as a diversity and inclusion lead for Spectra Energy and the City of Calgary, and as a trainer and facilitator for Human Resources and Skills Development Canada. Welcome to the podcast, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much, Mary. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today.
Well, I'd like to start with the basics. Where do you think the nonprofit sector is at when it comes to creating effective DEI initiatives, especially when it comes to diversifying their boards and leadership teams?
Yeah, this is such a great opening question to set the context. And DEI has been talked about for a very long time in the not-for-profit sector. I've been doing this work now for over 25 years, but some of my mentors have been doing this work for 30, 40 years. And I would say that perhaps it was called something different at the time, but it was still work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was also on nonprofit boards in Calgary some 10 and 15 years ago where we were already talking about this. I think for us, what has changed is that people are now more attuned to the needs for DEI. It's no longer something that, I think we should do. It's a nice thing to do. There's actually a social and economic, a people imperative for doing this work. And as I reflect back on the last few years in particular, with the murder of George Floyd in the US, with the impact of the COVID virus on rising anti-Asian hate sentiments, with the rediscovery of Indigenous graves across Canada, wars outside of Canada that impact the psychological safety of the folks here, the huge and ongoing immigration waves that we're seeing, right? Better understanding of what is disability in the workplace and how we can make changes meaningfully. All of these conversations are happening constantly. And I feel like, it allows us to really, it allows us, but also challenges us to really reflect on our personal values and the values of Canada as a country and as a society. And so at CCDI, we work with over 700 employers across Canada from all sectors, including the not-for-profit sector. And we have definitely seen a growing number of organizations wanting to commit to DEI in the past few years. There's a lot of public discourse, and I think that employers in the not-for-profit sector are finding themselves in this, intersection where, okay, do I want to join the public discourse? Do I want to educate myself? Or is that, too much for me at this point? Maybe as a leader myself or as an organization, we are not ready. But what we're seeing is that more and more people in the not-for-profit sector are really trying to move beyond just offering a workshop or just providing a toolkit to looking at DEI more holistically and more critically. Will my event actually lead to change? Will this workshop actually open minds, and in what ways? So I would say, Mary, as a final thought, Yes, I'm seeing some changes. I think the progression has been positive, but I would like to just put a caveat that we still need to stay vigilant because our society right now is quite polarized and there's quite a bit of misinformation about what is diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility. And so we need to be prepared, to have truthful conversations about the value and importance of DEI for ourselves, for our colleagues, and for our communities, and for our organization.
You've painted the picture of the context in which we find ourselves, um, particularly over the pandemic years, but leading up to this moment in time so powerfully. Um, and it begs the question, what are some of the biggest barriers that equity serving groups face when it comes to moving into leadership roles in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, there are so many barriers. There are barriers around the fit. And so, for example, as a Canadian society, when you look at, what a leader looks like in an organization, it may not often look like a member of an equity deserving group, right? And so historically as a society, we don't have enough exposure and experience in understanding what is an inclusive leader, what does a diverse leader looks like, and how they act. So there's a lot of unknown factors that I think um, are part and parcel to our understanding of what it will take for us to really create systems, practices, and cultures to invite diverse leadership into our organizations. The other thing, too, is equity serving groups often have shared with us the challenges when they join an organization that the leadership of the organization or the people in the organizations don't have a good understanding of the historical and contextual challenges of diversity and inclusion. So, for example, if we are talking about truth and reconciliation towards the First Peoples of Canada, do we know what that really means, right? Have the leaders of an organization read the TRC Commission report and the the calls to action? There are 94 calls to actions, and some of them are specific for organizations on how they can commit to truth and reconciliation. Um, do folks in the organizations understand their own power and privileges? And when you have diverse leaders joining, do they understand how to leverage their power and privilege to actually amplify diverse leaders and thought the leadership in an expansive way, in a way that is dynamic, that perhaps challenges the status quo, but allows diverse voices and important community voices to be part of the decision making process? Those, I think, are very important barriers that we need to understand, to learn about. We may need to try to unlearn some of the things that perhaps we believe that is not quite equitable or not quite fair for other folks. And just to create then, okay, what are some of the strategies, what are the commitments that as an organizations I need to consider in order for us to truthfully move towards inclusive leadership in our organization?
So, how can nonprofit organizations actually eliminate these barriers? Is there something that can be done through policy work or, internal training, or are there other factors at play that need to happen in order for this to become a reality?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question because really policy work is important, but there's so much more that we need to consider to eliminate these barriers. I'll start with policy work. So, yes, it is important because, for example, if you want change to happen systematically, then you need to put the systems in place, which, for example, may mean we need to review our hiring policies and practices and be more consistent Maybe we need to do more community outreach if the same people apply for the jobs, and we find our pool to be very homogeneous, right? So if in the policy it says you need to do community outreach or partner with a diverse recruitment organizations or communities, then you know that that has to be part of your process. So policies are definitely really important. Look at your EAP, right? Your employee assistance program. Are the benefits inclusive? Does it take into account, for example, counselors and therapists that actually have experience supporting, let's say, your employees who are refugees, right? Your employees who's has different family dynamics, and culturally, the role of the spouse, the parents, the grandparents may look a little bit different. So the therapist is providing culturally appropriate solutions and support to the employees, right? Do you have budget allocated towards DEI initiatives, training, mentorship, and coaching? So definitely, it goes beyond policy to understanding all of the benefits, training, programs that support employees to do well and to be well. And this training, this support is not a one time thing. That's a check mark exercise that can be very performative. It's an ongoing commitment. And that's why sometimes it's not easy to do, because you want to do it thoughtfully and strategically. And the other thing, too, that I want to add, because I think it's really important in this conversation, is that the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is hard work. There is an emotional tax or burden for individuals to do this work, especially if they have been marginalized historically and in their own experience. And so, in order for us to do this work in our own organization, I think that the organization, the employer also have to create, a work environment that is culturally and psychologically safe for them. Maybe it's not perfectly safe because we're always learning and we're always trying to improve, but at least to try to set the conditions and to learn from our mistakes, to be humble and vulnerable, that we don't know it all, and to consult with diverse employees and leaders and even the community to really better understand what we can do to truly create an inclusive environment for all, where individuals don't feel like they have to change who they are in order to fit in, or that term code switching, where you have to change your natural hair into, you think, a hairstyle that is more quote unquote professional, or that you're afraid of wearing a particular dress, or to put pictures of your better half on your desk because you're afraid that you may not feel like you belong in a culture that perhaps is more homogeneous than it can be. All of those pieces work together, and it's the holistic aspect of this work that I think allows people to see themselves in the work and to say, okay, maybe in areas of culture or in areas of training or mentorship or HR or programming or community involvement, there's a role that I can play to be part of that fuller picture of inclusion for all.
Well, on that point, a new report from the Diversity Institute and Civic Action looks at diversity in leadership in Ontario's nonprofit sector. And part of the report focused on the experience of equity deserving groups in their leadership roles. Why is it important to go beyond diversity into those elements of inclusion and equity, especially in leadership roles?
Yes, excellent. So, first of all, I do want to say that knowing about the diversity of your workplace is really important. Okay. I would say that, yes, diversity is about the numbers. the percentage in your workplace of, let's say, women or persons with disabilities, or indigenous peoples or racialized folks or members of the 2S LGBTQ plus A community. It could be generational diversity. It could be so many kinds of diversity. That, if we track the numbers, allows us to understand whether our hiring practices work or not, right? If we have representation that is proportional or on par with market availability, then we know that we are doing well, that we're working well on creating that representation. That's excellent. The challenge is, if an organization only looks at representation and numbers, it's going to miss the boat on what it can do to keep that diverse leader from staying in the organization, right? And that's why, oftentimes people ask me, well, Anne-Marie, do I focus on diversity first or do I focus on inclusion? I said, if you had to choose, focus on inclusion first. You want to be able to create a work environment where people want to stay. You don't want the revolving door syndrome where, as soon as they go into the organization, they'll be leaving the organization because they just don't see themselves feeling like they can thrive in the organization, that there are too many barriers for them to actually be able to succeed. So I would say beyond diversity, absolutely, we need to talk about inclusion. And beyond inclusion, absolutely, we need to talk about equity. And equity is really the recognition that equal processes doesn't, like, they don't work for everyone. It's the recognition that we have a lot of diversity of experiences, of circumstances, and of perspectives. And in order to actually level the playing field, we need to understand what those differences are. And where needed, we need to put into place better practices, right? More inclusive practices, which requires adaptation. The adaptation would actually then create a level playing field where everyone has equal opportunity to thrive and succeed. So doing equity well leads to the outcome of equality. So there you go. It's diversity, but it's also inclusion, and it's also equity with the outcome of equality for all.
That was so well explained. I think it gives marvelous context to those that are struggling with what these different terms mean and how to, I guess, properly prioritize them, if they even should, and how to implement them. What are some of the most effective tools to help organizations move forward with creating better experiences for leaders from equity deserving groups once these leaders have actually joined the organization? I mean, I guess this is the part of um, the inclusion piece that you were talking about in order to really make them feel at home and comfortable and wanting to stay.
I love that. I love that. And I would say, um, it's the leaders from the equity deserving groups, but it's also the other leaders who may not be from equity deserving groups. And I think for me, there's a lot of education and conversation and support that is required at the top level. That it really is. I think sometimes leaders are given a huge responsibility to, do all of this work for their organization, right? It could be strategic planning, financial governance, community outreach, client service, so many priorities. And yet, do they have a strong foundation of DEI in order to excel in their jobs? And so I would say, if we were to look at the DEI lens, let's train all of the leaders around the foundational aspects of DEI. That means having common language, trying to understand what equity means, right? Are we all saying the same thing? Does this make sense? To understand power and privilege, and for leaders of both equity deserving groups and other leaders to say and reflect on what What is my story? Where is my role? What are my connections? What are my privileges? And how can I leverage my privilege to change the organization for the better for everyone? It's to understand unconscious bias and how it shows up in different places and different settings. And it's to understand cultural competence. First and foremost, do I have an understanding of myself as a cultural being, who I am, my various dimensions of diversity, the things that I know that I am an expert on, but the things that I don't know, right? And it's okay not to know things, but it's important to recognize that and then to seek that knowledge, um, and to show up in a way that you are grounded. You are grounded in your identity, but you're also decentering yourself so that you can hear the perspectives of the people around you. And for the folks from equity deserving groups, I work a lot, for example, with Asian people, right? And there's this myth, that in the workplace that Asian individuals are more quiet, are more submissive. There's a docility myth out there about Asian people, that they don't have a voice. And certainly, a lot of people from Asian communities have been raised through a collectivist mindset. And so perhaps they don't speak up directly as much in order to be respectful of their leader or their elders, and to really think of the good of the collective, which is more important than their own good. And so a lot of Asian people, perhaps, and I don't want to generalize ever, but I know a number of Asian people don't self promote. They don't speak up, even though they have brilliant ideas in their minds, right? And so I have an Asian professional network that I co founded and I'm on the steering committee of in Calgary. And we do work like this, where we are providing perspectives and skills to Asian professionals to help them into leadership positions, right? And as an organization, what you can do is also have conversations with your diverse leaders and say, what's going on? How can we help? Are there barriers that you're experiencing that perhaps we can provide you support with? And if we don't have the support internally, because oftentimes an organization wouldn't, then perhaps provide training budget, funding budget for that leader to access a group like the Asian Professional Network of Calgary or any other network that actually will support their specific needs. So there's work to be done internally to create the common language, the common values and understanding of inclusive leadership. And then there are specialized supports for leaders who are not diverse and for leaders who are diverse to help them on their journeys so they feel confident, they have the tools and the courage to do the work that's needed.
I'd like to move to the most recent legislation that's at play and proposed right now. Senator Ratna Omadvar's Bill S-279 would update the T3010, the annual form that charitable or nonprofit organizations have to include annually in their reports to their returns to the CRA. Um, she wants to modify that to include a question to measure the diversity within the boards of charities. Do you feel a step like this is important for the sector? And why is measurement important?
I would say, first of all, it is a step in the right direction. I truly believe that. And I'll give you some context. Earlier, you mentioned in my introduction that I worked for the Human Resources and Skills Development Canada. And at the time, it was part of the Racism Free Workplace Strategy. And my role was to really provide education and support for employers who were federally legislated under the Employment Equity Act, as well as federal contractors that may be provincially regulated, but because they have a contract with the government of Canada at a certain number with over 100 staff, they had to also commit to employment equity. So both the legislated employers and the federal contractors had to report every year on their diversity metrics, on the four designated groups: women, visible minorities, which are racialized minorities, persons with disabilities, and indigenous peoples. Very similar to what Senator Almadivar is proposing. And I would tell you that in my 5 years working in that role, as I worked closely with various employers, I could see that, you know, they had to create a system and a structure in their workplace to showcase what they were doing to reach out to diverse communities and diverse talent pools. They had to think intentionally about how they onboarded their new employees in a way that was inclusive. They had to think of ways in which they could retain their workforce. They had to think ways in which they could promote their workforce. And in some places, they were also doing exit strategies to understand why, employees left the organization, and does it have anything to do with DE and I. So this is a step in the right direction for me, Mary, in the sense that um, it's going to really challenge organizations to think differently about the way that they have been hiring diversity and leaders in their organization, and think of the ways in which they can do better. And that's why I think measurement is important, because when you measure it, you know where you're at. And when you have goals, you know where you want to go.
Yes, I spoke to someone who said, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, that you actually have to be able to measure your progress. And this is one way of being able to do that. And is that what you mean?
That's exactly it, right? Because it's true that you cannot measure everything under the sun, and that there will be some things that are harder to measure. But when it comes to representation of diversity at the leadership level, it is something that is measurable. And so I think it is important for us to take heart in creating the right processes in place to measure that thoughtfully and as accurately as possible, and then to report on it and have honest conversations about, does this measure make sense for where we're at on our journey? What else can we do to improve? Or let's celebrate our successes, because wow, we've done so well, and how can we sustain it, right? So the conversation shifts from doing better to sustaining and thriving. And at the end of the day, I think that's what we want for the not-profit sector, is it's such a critical sector for Canada. We want the not-profit sector to thrive and to truly engage the diverse communities that it serves.
Now, can you tell us about some of CCDI's programs and how they can help nonprofit organizations create this kind of meaningful change in the DEI journey?
Yeah, absolutely. We have hundreds of not-for-profit organizations that are part or member of the employer partner program at CCDI. And their annual subscription to our program really allows them to access multiple learning events and resources every month in both English and French, to build both their individual capacity, but also their organizational capacity. So, for example, we publish research, toolkits, resource guides on the regular basis on various topics. There's one that just came out on inclusive hiring practices, as a matter of fact. And so they can access that. They can listen to our podcast. They can participate in our learning webinars on various topics. I have one coming up in May for Asian Heritage Month, where in fact we will be talking about the docility myth, as well as the bamboo ceiling, which is the equivalent of the glass ceiling for women, but for Asian people, we call it the bamboo ceiling. We also have community of practice events, both virtually and in person, where people can come together and build community and network and support each other. And we have our annual flagship Unconference, which is a national virtual conference that we host in Q1 of every year, where we have thousands of people come together in solidarity to learn and exchange. So we are really here for an employer no matter where they are on their journey. You know, Mary, people sometimes are at the very beginning stage, and others have been doing this work for 20, 30 years and now looking at different ways to partner with CCDI. And that's all good. Where we open our arms and our heart to all of the organizations and individuals who really want to make a difference for the people that they work with on this D&I journey. The last thing that I would add as well is we have a very a special partnership right now with the UN Global Compact Network of Canada as part of the Government of Canada's 50-30 challenge. And I don't know if folks know about the 50-30 challenge, but it's this opportunity right now for organizations, including folks in the not-for-profit sector, to increase representation at the senior leadership level and on their boards. And organizations that sign up for the 50-30 challenge to commit to have gender parity and at least 30% representations of other equity deserving groups can access free and complimentary training from CCDI through our partnership with the UN Global Compact Network Canada. And there are other ecosystem partners outside of us who also provide this service. So check it out and really, maximize those resources that are available to all of you.
Well, I'm so proud that you mentioned the 50-30 challenge. Charity Village and myself, on behalf of Charity Village, was part of some of the technical standards that were developed in relationship to the 50-30 challenge. So we are very much in favor of that extraordinary initiative, and looking forward to continuing to be involved. So we're delighted that CCDI has dived in and is taking such an important role in I think disseminating the goals and training around the capacity building in order to achieve um, the goals of the 50-30 challenge. I'd like to close by asking you, overall, Anne-Marie, are you optimistic, given the context that we find ourselves in today, that we'll see a real shift in the years to come in terms of diversity and inclusion at the leadership level in the nonprofit sector?
I am optimistic. Oftentimes, people who know me very well often say, Anne-Marie, you always think of the cup as being half full and not half empty. But I would say, as a leader in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to be optimistic, right? If we're not optimistic, then how will we bring people along, right? How will we be able to actually create the change if we cannot even envision what that change looks like? In our time to care for one another, in this time where things are so divided and so polarized, I think we have a stronger responsibility to actually commit to this work even more. And so, if you're listening to this podcast, and you are a leader of your organization, or you are, an influencer without formal authority, but you can still be a leader of change in DEI, what is your value proposition for this work? Where do you see yourself playing a role in this work, right? What is the future of work and your role within it? Take a moment to envision what that looks like and then work backwards from there. How can I transform myself? How can I be dynamic in a way that encourages inclusion? How can I be ever evolving so that change no longer feels like resistance, but a possibility? And for me, all of these start with your mindset and your commitment to want to do right, not just for you, but really for others. And to build your own emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, and capacity to evolve with the times and to be a champion or ambassador of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So yes, I am, Mary, as you can feel, I hope, optimistic that we will see a shift in years to come. It's not easy. We are working against certain movements and challenges. that may make it feel like for every step that we take forward, we're also taking a step backward. But we cannot remain complacent. We have to actually cross the chasm to a place of real change and innovation, creativity to help everyone thrive in a society to be truly, the vision for what we want Canada to be.
Well, Anne Marie, you're a very eloquent and inspiring champion for this journey that so many nonprofit organizations are currently on, and encouraging others to begin that journey. Thank you for your insights into the diversity of the Canadian nonprofit leadership. Your expertise and perspectives are so valuable to nonprofit leaders as they pursue their EDI journeys for their organizations. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you very much, Mary, for the opportunity. I'm so pleased and grateful.